Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashraful anbi wa mursaleen. Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Sorry for the delay in the start of our session. I think we need to be liberated from men who overrun their time, don't you think? It always happens. But my name is Farina Alam, and I'm going to be your chair today, which is essentially a glorified timekeeper. What I've asked the panelists to do is keep their remarks as brief as possible, because we have a roaming mic, and I would really like this to be an open discussion. So we'll open it up to the floor after the remarks, and we'd really like to hear from you, so that this is more of a conversation more than anything else. So let's press on. I'm going to introduce our first panelist. She is Merve Kavakçe. I don't need to introduce any of these women really, but I will. Merve was famously elected to parliament in Turkey, but because she refused to take off her hijab, and Turkey has, let's just say, interesting rules to do with secularism, she wasn't able to take her oath, and eventually she was stripped of her citizenship. She is now doing very well in the United States. She is a professor at George Washington University, and she has her master's from Harvard University and a PhD from Howard University. And she's also a hafiza of the Quran. So without further ado, Merve, if you could go to the podium. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, second time around, to see and witness the flourishing of the Islam Expo that was outset 2 years ago. I hope that the organizers will get the rewards of their efforts, both in this world and the hereafter. We have convened to discuss a very interesting topic today, and a very wishy-washy topic, if you will, and we're very much challenged by the time constraints. Therefore, I'll try to do a good job in giving justice to various components of my brief remarks, and then leave the rest to the Q&A session. Islam Expo is definitely a direct fruit of the British Muslims, larger European Muslims, standing up to express themselves to bridge the gaps in between the worlds. We know that after the September 11 attacks, and probably long before then, but it very much became clearer after the attacks, Islam sat in our agendas in international relations, political science, women's studies, in popular culture, and as well. Islam's compatibility with democracy, human rights issues, and women's issues in Islam became the most important, rather riveting parts of our discussion on Islam. In probing all of these issues concerning human rights in Islam, women's rights in Islam, and democratization in Muslim societies, movers and shakers in the Western world took where they stand in the Western societies as the departure point in discussions. Against the Western values, they examine the lives and then they evaluate the lives of the Muslims. But it is important to note that their departure point is based on their own experiences in the Western world. In the women question, they turn to the empirical evidence in the Muslim world and argue that, look at the plight of the Muslim women out there. It is terrible. This is an unrefutable reality. Nobody can deny that. But they go on to make generalizations very much and find the religion of Islam to be the reason behind the plight of the Muslim women. Muslims, on the other hand, respond to those allegations of Muslim women lagging behind and argue that Islam actually, on the contrary, has liberated women, emancipated them. So which one is it? Do Muslim women need liberating or not? For me, the answer in a nutshell is yes. Muslim women do need liberating and emancipation in 4 areas contemporaneously. To be able to liberate them in one of the 4 following areas will not suffice, will not let us succeed. They must be liberated in 4 different areas at the very same time. Muslim women are constrained and captured under the Orientalist assumptions. This is no news to us. It's a historical fact. When you read the writings of the Orientalists, you can go as far as you want in history, you will see the depiction, abject depiction of the Muslim women by the Orientalist professionals. Somehow, Muslim women must rid themselves of the trappings of the Orientalist assumptions. What are those assumptions? Immediately, without any exploration, we say that Muslim women are subjugated, they are repressed, they are oppressed. We make generalizations about them. We take one case, one terrible case, and turn it into a larger fact about Muslim women. The Orientalists, of course, stay at a distance to their subject matter, be a Muslim man or women, and tend to make their own generalizations. The departure point, or the standards that Muslim women are measured against, are always the ones that stem from the Western experience. This Western experience does not have any flexibility or room for variety and diversity. Therefore, it is only one way, the Western way, based on the Western experience. In this very intransigent set of standards, for instance, the hijab of Muslim women is perceived as problematic. From the get-go, you cannot even open it up for discussion. When you read the Orientalist arguments, you incessantly see the assumption that a covered woman cannot be compatible with a non-covered woman or man, for that matter. And these Orientalist assumptions leak into the very popular culture of our days as well, in politics and in social arena. I remember the European Court of Human Rights case decision decreed a few years ago on Şahin versus Turkey case, for instance, where a young woman called Mrs. Şahin took the Turkish Republic to the European Court of Human Rights for not being able to wear her headscarf at the university in Turkey as a medical school student. Of course, the decree was against her at the end of the day. However, the subtle message given in the European Court of Human Rights decision was very much revealing for us. The discussion was on the question of, if a woman with a headscarf could ever be equal to any other citizen who would claim human dignity and argue that she needs to receive her citizenship rights, such as education. My own European Court of Human Rights case was not any different, although I won in the European Court of Human Rights against the Turkish government for preventing me from taking my oath of office. But I remember when I arrived to Strasbourg to work with my French lawyer, Monsieur Hinker, and we were preparing for my testimony for the day after, and he was constantly going on the way I dressed up that day, and if I was going to dress up in a modern Muslim clothing. And he went on to emphasize on my educational background, the fact that I was a Harvard graduate, the fact that I was a professor at George Washington University. And at some point I got frustrated and asked him, why do you really care about that? Let's just concentrate on the facts, what happened in the parliament. He said, no. It is important that the judges at the European Court of Human Rights recognize you as a contemporary Muslim woman. And he kept his promise and gave his testimony accordingly. So I was wondering in the courtroom, after giving my testimony, hearing my lawyer address the court, if I was not a woman who graduated from Harvard University and a woman who doesn't wear what she wears, but a woman in some other clothing, say a black abaya with a niqab on her face, would that really mean that I would not deserve my human and civil rights and liberties? The second area where I see that Muslim women are very much imprisoned and therefore must be liberated from is the area of their indigenous cultures and local traditions that become very much inextricable from the way we understand our religion. Some of our cultures, let's admit it, and rituals are very antithetical to Islam, but they are carried out in the name of Islam. That's a reality. I had a friend, a very beautiful Pakistani Indian origin girl in Dallas, Texas, who got married, and then the marriage did not work out. And after several years, I confronted her. Well, will you not get a divorce? And we know that they are separated and so forth. She said, that's not in our culture. That is in our religion, but not in her culture. An outsider would see that and immediately feel sorry for the girl. Oh, poor girl. Of course, she cannot get a divorce because she's a Muslim. So the fact that our local cultures are inextricably intertwined to the way we live Islam, and the fact that we do not really know Islam, makes Islam pay the price at the end. The third area where I feel that Muslim women must be liberated is the male monopoly over the interpretation of Quran. Empirical evidence that I referred to in the first item concerning the subjugation of the Muslim women in the Western eye is somewhat, to an extent, predicated upon this very item. There is no explanation for the gap in literacy rates between men and women in our world. Isn't it our religion that mandates us to learn from the cradle to the grave, both men and women? Look at the Muslim world, what it suggests to us. Where do women stand on that? Isn't it our religion that mandates or warns us against the one whose 2 days are equal to one another. That is to mean, if there's no progression in your life from one day to another one, you're in loss. Where are the Muslim women? Where is their plight? There's no way to justify the clip, a video clip that stays with me forever, that my Harvard professor showed us in class one day, where we see a young girl, a young small girl with acid on her face thrown by her father because she was playing with boys on the Pakistani streets. That's a reality. We must change that by learning our religion, first of all. Fourth and the last area of liberation, hopefully, will be from the secular fundamentalists. We always talk about the Islamic fundamentalists, the Islamic extremism in this world, but we never come to speak about secular fundamentalism, which is, by the way, very prevalent and very pernicious. Look at the example of France, Tunisia, and finally Turkey, when we talk about the issue of hijab. It is there. It doesn't matter really if a Turkish girl is very smart, at the top of her class, ranking a valedictorian as she graduates from high school and attends to a medical school. Someone, a secular fundamentalist someone, cannot just get past the way she looks in her hijab. It doesn't matter if that girl will become the best surgeon in the country and she will contribute to the Turkish society or to the Tunisian society for that matter. Some secular fundamentalist person just cannot get past her looks. That is very dangerous. And the more we focus just on religious extremism vis-a-vis Islam, we turn on blind eyes and fall on deaf ears as far as the dangers of secular fundamentalism is concerned. In a brief final remark, if we can liberate the women of Islam in these 4 areas, I would say, then Muslim women would really be emancipated. So referring to another political scientist colleague, Leela Gandhi's concept on double colonization, maybe we can talk currently about triple or quadruple victimization of the Muslim women. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Merve. If I could invite to the stage now Yvonne Ridley, who needs no introduction. Yvonne was captured by the Taliban when she was doing an undercover story in Afghanistan in 2001. And she returned, and 30 months later, she became a Muslim. And now, I mean, she was always a award-winning journalist, and now she works for Press TV for a very popular show called The Agenda. Yvonne.
Thank you for that introduction, Farina. Brothers, sisters, friends, assalamu alaikum. I have been a feminist for as long as I can remember and have always fought for the liberation of women long before I became a Muslim. But as soon as you mention words like liberation and feminism, you can almost feel the resentment from some individuals who claim to be educated and open-minded. Some men even have the nerve to tell me what women really want. I mean, what would I know about a woman's feelings, needs, and expectations? I am, after all, simply a woman. The arrogance of these chauvinists is nothing more than breathtaking. Actually, this irrational male fear of feminism is pretty much universal and crosses nationalities, skin color, cultures, and religions, so we can't blame Muslims. Sadly, the female liberation movement of the 70s neglected the needs of Muslim women and failed to address the cultural differences. The net effect excluded non-Western women from the liberation movement or forced Muslim sisters to compromise their beliefs to fit in with a lifestyle which is at odds with Islam. But since there are so many misconceptions about feminism, perhaps I should open with a definition. And like many definitions, it depends on which side of the fence you're positioned. For instance, that Christian fundamentalist, the Reverend Pat Robertson, a man who has the ear of the President of the United States, is horrified at the thought of liberated women, regardless of their beliefs. Allow me to quote the Christian cleric, who is one of the most powerful figures in America's Bible Belt. He said, "Feminism encourages women to leave their husbands, kill their children, practice witchcraft, destroy capitalism, and become lesbians." Meanwhile, in 1913, the celebrated writer Rebecca West and a leading women's rights campaigner said, "I myself have never been able to find out precisely what feminism is. I only know that people call me a feminism whenever I express sentiments that differentiate me from a doormat." The term feminism was first used in France in the 1880s by the writer Hubertine Auclair to criticize male domination. She was merely trying to highlight the fact that women's rights and emancipation, which had been promised by the French revolutionaries, had not materialized. In short, their revolutionary men had sold them down the river. Ever since then, though, the term feminism has inspired many movements and continues to do so today. But there are those who believe that Islamic feminism is a contradiction in terms. But I still consider myself to be a feminist, a tireless promoter of women's rights, as well as being a Muslim. I would humbly suggest that Islamic feminism has nothing to do with those poor confused sisters like Irshad Manji, Ayan Hirsi Ali, and Amina Wadud, who endlessly talk about Islam's need to modernize. I would say to them, if you want to go off and start your own movement, just do it. The Islam you talk about never has and never will exist. There's no compulsion in religion. Just don't let the door hit you on the way out. They are as deluded as those backward brothers who simply do not see an equal when they look at a sister. And believe me, there are plenty around, from the village backrooms to the city boardrooms. Strive as they might to treat all women as equals, they simply cannot shake off this mentality or culture. But before the accusations start, I can tell you I have no problems with segregation of the sexes, although I do have real issues with sisters being shunted off into dark, dank corners while brothers sit in comfortable, well-lit and warm surroundings. I did not embrace Islam to become a second-class citizen, as anyone who tries to treat me as a lesser being will discover. Islamic feminism, I believe, derives its understanding and mandate from the Holy Quran, which offers a blueprint for the rights and justice of women as well as the men. Now, this might come as a shock to some of you, and to be fair, there has been a great deal of misunderstanding and misrepresentation surrounding Islamic feminism. And to be truthful, it's not just the brothers to blame. We must all take responsibility for allowing outsiders, as well as those in the deen, to believe that women are not equals. One of my dearest friends is a young sister who is a very high achiever. Top of her class, she went on to achieve the same status on her law degree course. On graduating, you'd think her parents would be delighted. Sadly, instead of encouraging her to greater things, her father said, "A degree is not going to get you a husband." I have to say I've come across this attitude all too often in some sections of our community. Don't these Muslims know that the Quran states quite clearly that women are equal in spirituality, worth, and education? Our beloved Prophet, peace be upon him, clearly revered and adored women for their strengths and their weaknesses. Yes, we're not perfect, but he insisted that paradise was under the feet of mothers and told us that the most important person in the home was the mother, the mother, the mother. 3 times he said that. The first revert to Islam was a woman, the first martyr to Islam was a woman, and the guardianship of the first ever copy of the Holy Quran in book form was entrusted to a sister. Sisters fought alongside the Prophet, peace be upon him, and their companions on the battlefield, as well as tending to the wounded, promoting dawah work, and even sacrificing and offering their children as scholars and martyrs of the future. Muslim women continued to take part in jihad over the centuries. In Iraq, for instance, they fought alongside their men during the 1920s against the British Army. History, I can reveal, has repeated itself once more in Iraq as women actively take up arms with the resistance. During the first 3 generations of Islam, the role of women were equal to that of men and continued to make a great impact right up to the 10th century as scholars who taught men and women alike. In the time of the companions, the question never arose concerning the validity of learning directly from women. If we were to consider, for example, the books of prophetic tradition called the Hadith, in every chapter you will find women narrating as well as men. Imam Hakim Nispuri states, "1/4 of our religion depends on the narrations of women. Were it not for those narrations, we would lose 1/4 of our religion." The Mosque of the Prophet, peace be upon him, is undoubtedly one of the most sacred places in Islam, and his blessed grave is even more sacred. Around the beginning of the 8th century of the Muslim calendar, Fatima bint Ibrahim, a famous teacher of Bukhari, was invited to speak in the Prophet's mosque when she had performed Hajj. Her fame was such that as soon as the students of Hadith heard that she had reached Medina, they all turned up in great numbers to the Mosque of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Ibn Rashid al-Subki, who traveled from Marrakesh, describes one of her classes. He said, "She was sitting in front of the blessed head of Prophet, peace be upon him, and due to her advanced years, she would lean on his grave. She would finish by writing and signing the license to transmit her narrations personally for all of the hadiths that were read by every student present." This and similarly stories make it clear that women can teach in the best of the mosques. So isn't it pathetic that today there are debates over whether women should even come to the mosque for prayer in this country, and it's an absolute outrage that some of these mosques are refusing sisters to go in and pray. This is an indication of our ignorance of our own Islamic heritage and our digression from the practices of our pious predecessors. As a feminist, I was aghast on the rights bestowed on Muslim women 1400 years ago. These are rights which have only come into the gift of Western women in the last century. Inheritance, home ownership, business and trading was inconceivable 100 years ago for our sisters in the West. Critics of Islam are quick to mention the subjugation of women's rights and freedom of speech as Islamic law's main failures, but they never provide any evidence. They would do well to remember that 1400 years ago, when the Quran was established, women could gain separation from their husbands. English law did not realize this until 1857. In fact, less than 100 years ago, women in Britain couldn't even vote. They had no political voice. In fact, about half an hour's drive from my parents' home in the north of England, there's the grave of a great woman who martyred herself in 1913 to highlight the political injustices of women in Britain. Today, she would be called a terrorist and probably be locked up in Belmarsh, but for millions of women across Britain, she's a martyr and a heroine. She was called Emily Davison, and she spent years in and out of prison on hunger strikes and resisting the laws of the land to fight injustice against women. And when she threw stones against politicians, they were often wrapped in her favorite words, "Rebellion against tyrants is an obedience to God." I think that's quite Islamic. She died in June 1913 after trying to grab the bridle of the King's horse during the Derby. Although many suffragettes endangered their lives, she was the only one who paid the ultimate price. But by 1928, all adult women in the UK were able to vote thanks to her sacrifice and that of other suffragettes. But as a point of interest in the Muslim world, Kenyan, Palestinian, Iraqi, and Pakistan women were eligible to vote in the mid-late 40s, followed a decade later by their sisters in Egypt, Tunisia, Mauritius, Malaysia, and Algeria. Swiss and Portuguese women, and remember, part of Europe, had to wait until the 70s for the privilege to vote. Feminists re-emerged as a strong force during the 70s and 80s across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, even though there are still some who believe feminism is purely a Western concept. It's not. As I stated before, we have a perfect mandate for the equality in the pages of our Holy Quran. The word of Allah, and there isn't a Muslim man alive who would be reckless enough to challenge the word of God, is quite clear where women stand. Consider the ayat affirming mutual responsibilities and equality as stated in Surah 9, verse 71 of the Quran, which says, "The believers, male and female, are protectors of one another." The Holy Quran maps out a perfect blueprint for feminism, and this has not gone unnoticed by Western women like myself, who started reading the Holy Quran and were amazed by the contents. And that is why I believe that in the West, more women are choosing Islam above any other faith. Everything that the feminists of the 70s strived for is embraced within Islam. If you look for it, if you seek knowledge, you will find it. I believe that Islamic feminism will soon become a global phenomenon and isn't a product of the East or the West. It was created by women for women, sisters across the planet. Some believe that there's a clash between secular feminism and religious feminism, but again, this is largely the product of mischief makers. After all, the thought of solidarity among all women terrifies some men. This solidarity was never more evident than when the student Vida Samadzi was crowned Miss Afghanistan and later paraded around at a beauty pageant in a bikini. Organisers hailed her emergence as a victory for women's liberation, a silly statement which received universal condemnation from feminists of all faiths and no faiths. In Britain, the secular and religious feminists have proved that they can work together in the anti-war movement, and this brand of sisterhood is nothing short of extraordinary. We Muslims love our largely atheist sisters, and the solidarity and respect is mutual. And there is a love and understanding that makes the sisterhood in the anti-war movement special. If Gordon Brown ever tried to rip the hijab off the heads of English schoolgirls in the same way that Chirac did in France, I know our secular sisters would be the first to march alongside us in protest. And I am confident with the solidarity shown on both sides, outrageous decisions as seen in Turkey, Egypt and Tunisia to rip the hijab off the heads of women there would never be tolerated in the UK. Also in Britain, politically, the secular and Islamic feminists have come together in the Respect Party alongside Christian and Jewish feminists, not to mention Sikh and Hindu sisters who are also united in this diverse sisterhood. And through Respect, I believe we will see the first hijab in the House of Commons when Salma Yaqub, who sadly can't be with us today, when she is elected representing Birmingham, inshallah. Islamic feminism advocates women's rights, gender equality and social justice, but we now need to get that message through to the media that Muslim women are not silent, oppressed creatures. Journalists need to be able to separate the difference between male-dominated cultures and Islamic practice. Forced marriages, honor killings, and little or no education for women is simply not Islamic. Islam strictly forbids all violence against women, including honor killings. In Sharia law, a man who expresses suspicion against the chastity of a woman must bring 4 witnesses, or such expression could result in severe punishment. Gossip against women is strongly prohibited. Honor killings do take place in Muslim countries, not owing to religion, but owing to conservatism, where the man thinks the woman is his property. Similar crimes are committed in America and are related to the activities of stalkers who have a similar view of women. Funnily enough, the highest rate of honor killings in the world today is in Jordan, a highly secularized but conservative country. It is true that some Muslim women are undermined by patriarchal influences and practices in the Muslim world. But I would remind these men of the farewell address made by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, which has deep relevance to the sisterhood. He said, "All mankind is from Adam and Eve. An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab has any superiority over an Arab. Also, a white has no superiority over a black, nor a black has any superiority over a white, except by piety and good action." For instance, there isn't a single woman who will go to the hellfire simply because she is a woman. Women, like men, will be judged on their piety and not their wealth, their power, good looks, or position in society. I was interviewed by a journalist recently who said that she thought women seemed to be totally under male domination in the Muslim world. I blame the colonialists for this. During colonial times, Muslims became inward-looking in their approach to religion, in their attempts to safeguard their way of life from the Europeans. As a result, they became conservative and restrictive in their attitudes towards their own women. Many of them started confusing conservatism with religiosity. Males used the situation to impose dominance on women. Thus, among the older generations of present-day Muslims, purdah or hijab is worn usually owing to the insistence by men or to please men, or often because males consider women their property. However, many Muslim women see the hijab very differently. Here, the Islamic dress is the sign of a woman's acceptance of the will of Allah and as a form of resistance to European and American domination. University women are now wearing Islamic outfits and hijabs, signifying their pride in being a Muslim, their love of Allah, and their refusal to be objectified as commodities in the consumer market. Others choose to wear the niqab or the face veil, and I believe they should be supported. Trust me, if we allow the likes of Jack Straw to rip the niqab off the faces of those sisters who wear them, the government will come after our hijabs next. There is no gender bias in the language of the Holy Quran. Consider the ayat in Al-Hujurat, "O humankind, we have created you from a single pair of a male and a female, and made you into tribes and nations, that you may know each other, not that you may despise each other. The most honored of you in the sight of God is the most righteous of you, the one practicing the most taqwa." There is nothing in the Holy Quran to say women must be servile to men, cook the dinner, wash his clothes, or wait on him. Marriage is a partnership, and the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, made that extremely clear in his last sermon. What we need to do now is encourage our next generation of young Muslims to become scholars of the caliber which emerged during the first 3 generations of Islam. So in conclusion, I would say that Muslim women are no different to non-Muslim women across the world. The only way that we can demand equality and liberation is by demanding our rights. So my conclusion is that all women need to be liberated, not just Muslim women. However, Muslim women are actually in a stronger position to do this because our mandate comes from the Holy Quran. And as I said before, there isn't a man stupid enough to challenge the word of God. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Finally, one of the most important voices, I think, to do with British Islam and British Muslim women, Maliha Malik. She is a reader in law at the School of Law at King's College, and she's working on a book on feminism and Muslim women due to be out next year.
Hello everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here because it gives me a chance to be on a panel with an old friend, Farina, but also to make new friends like Merv and Yvonne. And I can see some familiar faces in the audience as well, so I'm really happy to be here. I'm also really happy to be here because, as you've heard, I'm working on a book called Feminism and Muslim Women, but my work for that consists almost wholly of sitting in the British Library with books and pencils, so I hardly ever get to meet other Muslim women. So I'm particularly looking forward to the question and answer session, where I hope I can get some sense of your own viewpoint. And essentially what I wanted to do today, and I'll keep it quite brief, is to make just a couple of points. The main part of what I want to say focuses on 2 issues. I say something about the way in which some of the non-Muslim attitudes and contexts are problematic in terms of Muslim women's liberation, but I'd also like to say a few controversial things about the way in which certain attitudes and practices within the Muslim community of both men and women may be a barrier towards women attaining the kind of normative utopian dream that Yvonne has set out within the Quran. And the reason I want to do that is that I agree with everything that Yvonne has said. My own experience of having examined Islamic sources and Islamic history verifies everything that's been said about both the potential and the reality for women's liberation within both traditional Islamic sources, but also the reality of Islamic culture and Muslim societies. But I'd like to move the debate on a little bit because I think that it's quite important to get beyond the stage of saying, but Islam promises us all the rights. I think we also now need to be a bit grown up about some of our inquiry in politics and ask ourselves, well, if it's the case that Islam and the Quran gives us all these rights, why is it that systematically Muslim communities are failing to deliver on this potential? So I hope some of you won't mind if I end by pushing the debate towards this more controversial area. And if you want to attack me, that's fine, because I was educated in the British tradition where we don't think there's been a good debate unless there's a substantial amount of blood on the floor. So I really do welcome your criticism. But let me start by saying that, of course, as Yvonne said, all women need liberating. Who do they need liberating from? Mainly from men. But actually, as the experience that Merv has talked about, the experience of secular feminists has taught us, sometimes Muslim women need liberating from other women. And also what I want to say is that one of the most outstanding contributions of Western feminist thought is to teach us that sometimes women need liberating from themselves. Because one of the things I think that Muslim women can learn from Western feminist scholarship is that women sometimes internalize ways of thinking, ways of being, and practices which force them to think about themselves, which is incompatible with their sense of themselves as equal people. And sometimes it forces them to put up with practices within their homes, within their families, and from men, which are damaging to them. Either damaging in terms of attitudes that they put up with, but at their most extreme, damaging in terms of verbal abuse, forms of harassment, and at worst, forms of violence. So sometimes, unfortunately, Muslim women may need liberating from themselves as well. Now, the problem with this question, and the problem that I have in having a discussion about the needs of Muslim women, is the present context that we're faced with. Part of that present context is historical. So as Merv says, there's a long-standing history of Orientalism, which forces onto Islam, which forces onto Muslim women in particular, certain representations and stereotypes that are fantasies of the Western world. They're fantasies about what Europe thought was the reality of Islam, was the reality about Muslim women. And this isn't just something in the past. These Orientalist stereotypes are prevalent today. We see them in the fantasy of various male leaders in France, in Britain, Germany, but also feminists themselves, non-Muslim feminists, arguing that they need to rescue Western Muslim women from the hijab, that they need to rescue them from their own religion and from their own cultures. So that's one problem, and Merv's dealt with that so well that I think I don't need to go over that. But the second thing I want to do, which connects this talk with what you just heard about Iraq, is the political context of the war on terror. Because for someone like me to try and argue in favor of the liberation and or in favor of having a discussion about Muslim women, we're faced with an immediate and very dramatic problem. Because the types of people who've been talking about liberating women are people like George Bush, who in 2001 October argued that one of the reasons he needed to launch a war on Afghanistan was to liberate Muslim women. He said it again in February 2003 at the United Nations, where he said one of the main justifications for the war in Iraq was to liberate Muslim women. And it's quite clear when we look at what we see by the idea of liberation of these particular political leaders, that it consists of war, bombs, and terrorism. And when we look at the mayhem that's been caused by war in places like Afghanistan and in Iraq, we see the impact that these types of policies have on Muslim women who are at the forefront as victims of displacement, rape, and are forced into prostitution once they're displaced from areas like Iraq in particular. So the difficulty that someone like me has is that I don't want to make an argument in terms of liberating Muslim women that's going to give weapons and that's going to give succor to politicians like George Bush to justify the war on terror. But at the same time, I think it's not fair not to have this debate, because I think there's a whole generation of young Muslim women, and I think we owe it to them to have an open debate within the Muslim community about what's in their best interests. And the final thing I want to say about what's a barrier to someone like me speaking out in a place like Britain about liberating Muslim women is the domestic context. We have a domestic debate going on in this country about Muslims that is focusing on integrating Muslims into liberal values. And at the forefront of that agenda for liberation is the idea that Muslim women need to be liberated within Muslim communities to get them to comply with the norms of Western culture. And so what this debate does is to raise issues like the niqab. It raises issues such as the hijab, and it raises issues about Muslim women's religious practice as being a target for integration. And what tends to happen in this debate is that visible Muslim women become simultaneously represented as not only the victims of Muslim communities and their failure to integrate, but they get to bear the burden of policies of integration, and government policy tends to focus on them, to put pressure on them to reform themselves as those people who are going to bring up the next generation of Muslims to try and adapt these women. And it's building up a huge amount of political pressure as far as Muslim women are concerned. So what I hope I've done is to say something about what some of the problems are about having this discussion and the context that we face. And what I want to do in the second half is to say something about what the Muslim community could possibly do to try and take up this issue despite the substantial problems that they face. Now, as both Merv and Yvonne have said, I'm deeply committed to the view that the Islamic religious and intellectual tradition contains within itself the resources to be able to provide a paradigm for Muslim women to be able to access social, religious, political, and economic power and goods. There's nothing that I've come across, either in my readings of primary sources, Quran and Hadith, but also Islamic law, that suggests that Muslim women are systematically excluded, in particular from access to religion. So, for example, all religious obligations are equally imposed on men and women. Women are included in the promise of salvation if they are able to comply with the same requirements as men. And the ethical requirements and spiritual requirements of Islam are incumbent on both men and women. I mean, this is absolutely clear, even in the grammar of the Quran, that addresses not only believing men, but believing women specifically. But I think also it's important to look at the history of Muslim societies, as Yvonne has done, to show that there were prominent Muslim women, especially in the early years of Islam, before the Islamic tradition came into contact with hierarchical, patriarchal societies. Layla Ahmed's work shows that these women were very prominent and exercised religious, political, economic, and social power. But I think what we need to do is to now ask ourselves the question, why it is that Muslim societies are systematically failing to realize this particular potential. And I realize it's very difficult for any society, and particularly a community such as that in Britain, which is a small community comparatively, despite the propaganda about the Islamic threat, and which is often a community which is under pressure. It's very difficult to launch an internal criticism when everyone around you is waiting to pounce on you and criticize you. But I think that in terms of how we can launch that type of criticism, I think it should be possible for Muslim men and Muslim women to have an open debate about what constitutes an authentic form of Islam in Britain, a form of Islam that is able to adapt itself to mainstream society, that is able to adapt itself in a way that allows young Muslim women to have access to both political, economic, and social power within their communities, but also allows them to reach out and look outwards, out of the Muslim community, to the vast amount of opportunities that are available to them in the wider community. And I just want to give you a small example and perhaps end with this, that as part of my work as someone who's a tutor for admissions at the School of Law in King's, I often go to schools to try and encourage young women to apply to university. And one of the schools that I visit is a school in the East End of London with a very high Muslim population. And when I speak to the young girls who are about 8 or 9 years old, they tell me that they love doing sport, they love doing drama, and they love doing music. And I can see a huge amount of potential for these young girls to have an education that is creative, that opens them up to all the opportunities that they have, and that actually allows them to enjoy their time at school. And what worries me is when I meet the girls when they're about 13, when they're 14, and when they're 15. A lot of them have stopped doing sport, a lot of them have stopped doing drama, music, and have somehow taken the view that being a Muslim means that they have to reject all types of education and cultural opportunities that they have. And I think this is a serious problem. I think it's a problem that both parents and all of us, and especially political leaders in the Muslim community, need to confront head on, because I think it's not fair and it's not just for the next generation of Muslim women to face this type of restriction on their ability to have fun and to enjoy all the opportunities that living in Britain offers to them. So I want to end with just making 3 small points. First, to emphasize the point that I think in the Muslim community, and particularly amongst the Muslim political leadership, which is overwhelmingly male in this country, there's an urgent need to look to see whether or not they can reconsider and reformulate Muslim male attitudes, but also encourage Muslim women themselves to realize that they should make the most of all opportunities that they have in terms of access to social, economic, and public life. But secondly, I'd like to emphasize that in establishing Islam within British Muslim communities, I'd like to say that in fact it is a mistake to assume that only one type of Islam is viable or is legitimate. Whilst it's true, and I myself have openly, publicly supported the rights of Muslim women to wear the hijab and Muslim women to wear the niqab, I'd like to think that we can establish an atmosphere in which Muslim women who don't want to wear the hijab and who don't want to wear the niqab might be deemed to be wrong, but at least we can be deemed to be legitimate full members of the Muslim community who've made a certain choice, and we have the right to make that choice and bear the responsibility and consequences for that choice ourselves. I think we should have a debate about it, but I dislike being told, and I dislike women being excluded from the Islamic intellectual religious tradition because they make different ranges of choices. And if you look at the Islamic intellectual and religious tradition, there's always been pluralism in how Muslim women make choices, and we should retain that pluralism within our community. And finally, I wanted to end with a story. It's about a woman called Fatima al-Fahiri. I'm not sure it's the same Fatima al-Fahiri that Yvonne's talking about. But this Fatima al-Fahiri I'm talking about was a woman who was a refugee from Tunisia, and she moved to Fez in Morocco. And if you go to the mosque and the main university in Morocco, which is the Qarawin, you'll see a plaque to this woman, Fatima al-Fahiri, because she made a donation which established the Qarawin Mosque, and it established the University of Qarawin. It became the leading university in the whole of Europe. People came from all over the world, all over Europe, to study mathematics and philosophy and the social sciences at the Qarawin. One of the popes studied mathematics there and then went back to establish the Faculty of Mathematics in Paris. And so what I would say to the Muslim women here is that one of your ancestresses, Fatima al-Fahiri, in the 13th century, established a mosque and university that laid the foundations for the core aspects of knowledge in mathematics and philosophy that led to the development of the Renaissance and led to the formation of the European civilization that you're now a member of. So when you go out, you should realize, and you should walk quite proudly within Britain and Europe, knowing that it was a Muslim woman who laid the important foundations for the development of this particular civilization. So thank you very much for asking me to speak, and I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you, Maliha. We've run out of time, but we're going to take 2 or 3 questions all in one go. So if we could start with the gentleman with the blue shirt here. The lady in blue in the front and the lady in purple over there.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Ufuk Seçkin. I'm the Vice Chairman of Islamic Community of Milli Görüş in the UK. And I moved to the UK about 5 years ago from Germany. I was born and raised in Germany. And the reason being is that still it is widely not accepted among big corporations in Germany that people from certain backgrounds and religion work at high positions in Germany. So I can understand to a certain extent the problems of the sisters here, but globally, but also in Turkey, for example. My question is to Professor Kavakçı. You referred to the denial of many of our sisters to gain access to university in Turkey, and you also referred quite rightly to the human rights courts in Strasbourg. My question is, do you think that the EU accession process will bring an end to this absurd and totally preposterous ruling in Turkey? And my final remark is, even though thousands of sisters couldn't study in Turkey for the past years, it also had a positive effect. Many of the sisters had the chance to go out to the world and study at other universities globally. And I make everyday dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that the day will come soon that those sisters will come back to Turkey and contribute with their skill sets they gained and create a more stronger and successful country.
Thank you. Thank you. The lady in the front, please.
Assalamu alaikum everybody. My name is Khatija. I'm from Northamptonshire. First of all, this is not an attack to any of your panel, so please forgive me if that is how I may come across. I would like to say is I was quite enamored with Malia's speech. The last speaker. I really totally agree with what she's talking about, liberating amongst women. In that context, I would like to ask, where does liberalization fit in when mothers and fathers push their young daughters from the age of 5 to wear hijab, when they don't know the true meaning of to wear hijab? That's the first thing. The other thing I'm also talking about, Yvonne Ridley talked about women's rights, place in the mosque, in the masjid to worship. She then criticizes about Amina Wadood, and I want to know more about it because I met this wonderful lady. Thank you.
Finally, the lady in the jacket and purple top. Yes.
Hello, I'd like to raise a question to the panel, and excuse me if this question touches on subjects that were covered shortly before I attended the talk. But it's regarding an issue moving away from hijab to do with the importance that I think was highly commented on in the last speaker's speech regarding the importance of education. And inextricably linked to education, I want to ask the panel for any comments they may have in relation to an issue I think that's quite also like hijab, but also important to the feminist issue. And that is in relation to the view that a Muslim man can marry 4 women. And I want to know if the speaker from King's could comment on this, because my personal view on this, and I know the ethos, it seems, in the Quran is that he can only do so if he treats all the women equally. My personal view is that this is impossible, and that actually Muhammad meant it to be impossible as a deterrent. And I would like to know what some thoughts of the panels are on the subject in relation to the question of feminism and liberalization of treatment of women, because I think this also goes to the attitude of the practicing the rights of women, not just bringing up your children to say you are equal, but putting those rights of women into practice, into their lives in a very practical sense.
Thank you. Yvonne, if you could start from that end of the table and just sum up your thoughts.
Yes, I think the sister at the front was talking about Amina Wadood. For those of you who don't know, Amina Wadood created quite a stir and whipped up quite a bit of Islamophobia in New York several years ago when she insisted on leading the prayers, and she announced that she was going to lead the Friday prayers. The Muslim community in New York got very upset about this and put pressure on various mosques to refuse her entry, and in the end a Christian church opened its doors and said, you can lead the Friday prayers in here. There were various headlines in the newspapers and demonstrations, and a great deal of fuss was created by Amina. And I have to say, it did make the press, and there was a big storm whipped up. She tried the same stunt about 4 or 5 years earlier in South Africa, and people dismissed her, and it didn't even get a paragraph in the papers. Islam is quite clear about imams and the responsibilities that are there. It's an issue which is causing all sorts of problems in the Christian church at the moment over the issue of priests and bishops. I'm not a scholar. That's as much as I can really speak on this subject, and I don't really want to go further into that. But I would have said that what Amina did was attention-seeking for all the wrong reasons. She said Islam needs to modernize. I don't think it does. I don't think Islam needs to change at all. But as I said before, there's no compulsion in religion. If she wants to go off and start her own movement, let her just go and do it. As for the parents who push their children to wear the hijab, this again is a thorny issue. All I would say is if I'd taken notice of my mother when I was younger, I wouldn't have made half the mistakes that I've made today. It's one of those issues where, I think you touched upon it before, when the wonderful thing about Islam is we are responsible for our own actions. And I'm not responsible for you, you're not responsible for me, but at the end of the day, we all have to answer for our actions and justify our actions. And while I would not criticize somebody who doesn't wear a hijab, I wear mine with pride. It's part of my business suit. It tells the world I'm a Muslim woman, take me seriously. Don't hit on me, don't offer me alcohol, don't give me pork scratchings. I love my hijab. It is a thorny issue, and the hijab, we could probably hold a whole separate debate on the issue of hijab. Again, I'm not a scholar, so I'm not going to sit here and issue fatwas. On the subject of polygamy, though, this is a question that comes up time and time again. And I think the person who asked the question was right in so many ways when she said the fact that you have to treat all 4 wives equally, doesn't that tell you that really it's an impossible mission? What is interesting is when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, drew up his own daughter Fatima's wedding contract, he wrote in that she would be the only wife in his lifetime. So that is an interesting issue. And I remember being asked recently, Muslim men can have 4 wives, why can't Muslim women have 4 husbands? I can't think of a single woman who would want 4 husbands. I think they're quite happy with 1.
Thank you, Alina. Yeah. Perhaps if I can just say something about the young 4-year-olds wearing hijabs and the polygamy question. So Khatija asked about concern about families who encourage young daughters to wear hijab. I think it's inevitable, and I think we all recognize that if you're a deeply religious person who thinks that there is a religious obligation for women to wear the hijab, when you're bringing up your family, you have the right to be able to create an atmosphere in your family that reflects your own religious commitments, your own religious values. I mean, the age at which girls start wearing the hijab, some people may think 5 is too young, other people might wait till 10. I think that's probably less important to me than the issue of the general atmosphere, I think, within which we're bringing up young people. I think that at some stage, irrespective of the age at which you chose the hijab, and I'm sure all my sisters in the audience would agree, at some stage it becomes a choice when you become an adult. And I think that what's important really in Muslim families is to create an atmosphere for parents to create an atmosphere where there's love, where there's affection, where there's proper forms of communication between their children and with parents, proper intergenerational communication. And I think that's really important because it's actually not a very good time for young people to try and be brought up in Britain whilst having a public commitment to Islam. And I think it's very important to have a safe, loving atmosphere in the home where they can turn to when they're having a spiritual crisis and when they're having all sorts of other crises as adolescents. They can turn to their parents in a non-judgmental way. And parents can provide them with the right amount of freedom, where they can adopt the hijab one day, take it off, adopt the niqab, take it off. And that's really the type of atmosphere that I think is an appropriate atmosphere for us to aim towards. On the polygamy question, it's a really difficult question. I mean, my own view is that I've never seen anything that makes me doubt that men have a right to be able to enter into polygamous marriages on certain conditions. But at the same time, I think, as Yvonne said, women have the right to be able to limit those conditions through a marriage contract, through entering and putting certain types of restrictions on men. I mean, there are ways of making a polygamous marriage more equal. There are ways of trying to assert your own power as the first wife within a polygamous marriage. Having said that, it is quite difficult, I think, because I think the power relationship which allows men to be able to impose a polygamous marriage on their first wives makes it quite hard for women to negotiate the right amount of power within their marriage. But, I mean, as a Muslim, as someone who studied the sources, I mean, you know, men have the right to enter into a polygamous marriage. But the only thing that I would say is that I think there is a debate to be had, but I think that in the public, in the media, we don't have a very rational debate about it, because I think the issue of polygamous marriage is just used as a stick with which to beat Islam.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll address the first question. Thank you. This was on the EU accession process of the Turkish Republic, and if that would solve the problem of the headscarf ban in Turkey. Well, theoretically speaking, it is supposed to. But of course, we have some reservations on that. Europe is, in of itself, European Union and the larger Europe is, in of itself, trapped in its own debacle, a quandary, having to come to terms with its own reality of the immigrant European Muslim population, as well as this 70 million country of Turkey coming to the verge, gates of European Union and knocking day after day. So I suppose the process in this past 6-7 years had come surprisingly hastened and expedited by all of the strides that the current government in power had made towards integration. So there's this pain of dealing with their own European Muslim community, who now claim that they are as Europeans as the non-Muslim French, British, and the German and Italian Europeans. These are the third and the fourth or the second generation Muslims here, no more who carry the baggage of being immigrant Muslims, as well as that Turkish pressure from outside. Then again, the European Union and the larger European population, including the European Court of Human Rights, which is sort of a prototype of the European community, has to come to terms with its own Orientalist assumptions and to dissolve them. So long as they do not do, the decisions, the decrees of the court are very clear. They are not able to get past that discussion on how could a liberated, empowered woman, how dare, or how come a woman would dress in the way that a Muslim woman would dress with hijab or veil, for that matter. So long as they don't get past that discussion, that problem will not be solved. Of course, they leave it at a very sort of politically correct place in the European Court of Human Rights decision and argue that this is an internal matter that Turkish Republic has to resolve. So if we solve the problem within the country, that would affect the larger European Muslim community as well. I also concur with your argument on the fact that this ban has begetted, in a way, led and entailed to some positive results and consequences. It was somewhat of a blessing in disguise as well. We're talking about girls and young women who come not from the elite classes of the Turkish society, who would have the opportunity to travel to other countries to seek education, but we're talking about the girls from rural areas and middle and lower classes of the Turkish society who are in a way catapulted, thrown out of the country, and seen this as an impetus, a liberating opportunity. So in a way you see that ayah in Quran, وَعَسَىٰ أَن تَكْرَهُوا شَيْئًا وَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ وَعَسَىٰ أَن تُحِبُّوا شَيْئًا وَهُوَ شَرٌ لَكُمْ وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ وَأَنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. The thing that seemed so negative led to maybe something positive at the end play out. We're also hoping that these women will someday come back and flock the country with their degrees, PhDs, and masters and professional degrees.
Very briefly.
Really, we're running over time.
Can I just, really one brief thing. I've just suddenly spotted that there's a 5-year-old Muslim man at the back there called Munir. And I have no doubt he's the future for Muslim men. So I'd like to dedicate my talk to him. He's come all the way from the Netherlands. There he is, over there. Thank you.
Thank you. Yvonne, yes. Yvonne, Maliha, and Merve, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for being a lovely audience. Assalamu alaikum.
Oh, wow. So you know him.